It's been a really wonderful day of discussion, and Tony Sach and I are going to just kick off the conversation, throw some questions at you, and then let you talk, and then maybe open it up to others in the audience. Let me start by just asking you, when you obviously went to China in 1972, you probably had no sense of where things would lead. Ultimately, the visit that you made with President Nixon and Henry Kissinger led to you becoming ambassador and then Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, and the whole 9 presidential administrations that embraced engagement. I wonder, during that period, what did you imagine the end game was going to be? Where did you imagine the US and China would end up? What would the evolutionary place finally be?
First, a couple of grace notes. I'm particularly happy, I don't know Tony as well, but to interchange with both of you. And Orville is an old friend and one of the greatest observers on China. I cannot resist, of all the books he's written, all the articles he's written, the single best one you can get is his novel, My Old Man, which is the second greatest novel by an American on China in the last 100 years. To answer your question, we're supposed to be talking about history and not policy, and I'll stick to that. But I want to play off the last panel and get back into your question. Let me say that I respect all 4 in that panel, but I'm firmly in the corner with the two-tango rightists as opposed to the whataboutist leftists. And I say that because I think leaders make a huge difference. And it gets back to my initial trips with the secret trip with Kissinger and Nixon and so on. I think Xi has made a huge difference in our relationship. And I think that's been a theme throughout the last 50 years, that leaders on both sides make a huge difference. I'll elaborate that theme in a minute. To get to your point, when we opened up to China, we did feel over the long period, given its history, given its culture, given its dynamism of its people, given its Middle Kingdom dominance for thousands of years, that China in the distant future would reassert itself and be extremely important. Nobody, not only us, but nobody else could have envisaged the astonishing growth and how fast they've reached the point of one of the 2 world's great powers. So we saw it in geopolitical terms. We saw the immediate terrain quite clearly, helping us versus the Soviets, helping us in Vietnam, helping stabilize Asia, helping lift the morale of the American people by a bold move, helping to show American credibility on the world stage that we weren't bogged down in Vietnam, and knowing China had 2 objectives: getting out of its cultural revolution isolation, and therefore more relationships would follow opening with us and to get into UN, and secondly, of course, balancing the polar bear to the north. So the near term was a geopolitical view of China as a useful adjunct, but we could not envisage just how far and how fast it would come by 50 years later. Now, I would like, very briefly, I'll get to your next question. The reason I think leaders are important, if you take what I would roughly divide the 4 phases of US-China relations in the last 50 years, leaders have been decisive. Of course, culture, history, geography is also important. But when we opened up in the 70s, it took leaders like Mao and Zhou on one side, Nixon and Kissinger on the other, to have the strategic vision and the political courage to move ahead despite 22 years of mutual isolation and hostility. So they made all the difference then. It was not foreordained that we could get in touch with each other. Then you go to the 1980s up to 1989, where we began to put in place the pieces of normalization after the relationship was established in 79, and began to increase contacts and trade. I was fortunate at the end of the 80s to be ambassador. where Dinda's husband was my shortstop to my second base on an American softball team. But it was the most open period in terms of internal debate, and also was the best period in U.S.-Chinese relations. And that was due in large part to Deng's positive influence in terms of reform and opening up. He was decisive on that, and American had normal presidents. But in '89, Deng was also decisive in the nosedive because of Tiananmen Square, and therefore leaders made a difference. He made a personal difference in the nosedive, even as he made it in the building up. Then in the '90s, you had the building back of the relationship after losing the glue of the Soviet balance, and the raising of human rights after Tiananmen Square, trying to establish more positive elements to the relationship that would last over time. And you had relatively normal American presidents and relatively more moderate Chinese leaders in Zhang and Hu. Then you get to the fourth phase in 2008, and since then, late Hu, but above all Xi, and that's why I'm in the two tango camp, not the whataboutism camp, because I think the deterioration has taken place as China's gotten stronger, deserves a rightful place on the world scene, that I think Xi is above all responsible for where we are today. Sorry to be so long, my future answers will be much briefer.
Okay, Winston, Tony Sage from the Kennedy School is going to follow up.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's been an extraordinary journey which you've undertaken. I think it's really important, you know, thinking about how that relationship started. And as you said, it really was a geopolitical issue, and both because of Soviet Union, and particularly, I think, with Vietnam. And then, in a sense, as you talked about, what was really unexpected was all the things that followed on from that. One thing struck me, you know, because you were the ambassador at a crucial time in those late 80s, and I've maintained for a long time that, to me, the most fascinating decade in China was the 1980s, and Orville's books that have sketched that are superb. But did you get any sense of a potential pushback and a backlash to that opening that was beginning to happen before the dramatic events of 1989?
I certainly did. We arrived in '85, and up to about '88, we had a situation where my wife, an author, an artist, and I, and our embassy officers could host dissidents, reformers, government and party officials around the same table talking about political reform. And we had a situation where our relationship, coordinating against the Soviets, high-level visits in both directions, increased trade, et cetera, was taking off. But by '88, the warning signals were there. First in '86, around Christmas, Hu Yabang was sacked after demonstrations in Shanghai. So that was sort of a overture to what happened a few years later. But the most dramatic example that I picked up was personal. In 1988, students at Beijing were running what was subsequently called Democracy Salon, where they would invite various speakers to come to the campus. The people who organized this turned out to be some of the leaders during the Tiananmen Square demonstration. We knew there was some unrest, but we had no idea the extent of it that was coming a year later. So my wife went out, and we spent a couple of hours with several hundred Chinese students. I was very careful to stay away from sensitive topics, knowing there were agents, of course, in the audience. We talked about our marriage and Chinese and American culture and many things. I even praised Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms and opening. The Hong Kong newspapers, for example, said Lord praises Deng Xiaoping. Well, to get back to your point about warnings, 3 days later, I was at a banquet. The then Chinese ambassador to the US, Hong Shu, came up to me with an extraordinary personal rebuke of me by Deng Xiaoping, in which he said, "Mr. Lord, you should not be going out meeting with students like this without our permission." I replied in diplomatic language, but I basically said, "Get lost." I'm going to keep meeting with students as I have been and with think tankers. If your ambassador, you, Mr. Ambassador, wanted to go to Harvard, you wouldn't have to get our permission. So that signaled to me the nervousness of Deng of what was happening. And indeed, the next 2 weeks, mysteriously, all my scheduled events at universities and think tanks got canceled. And we finally got over that, but that clearly told me more than anything else that something was afoot, although nobody could predict a year later that there'd be demonstrations, not just in Beijing, but 250 cities. And it wouldn't just be students, it'd be Chinese from all walks of life.
Sorry, just one follow up on that. What do you think was really at the source of that growing sort of fear amongst the elite of those kinds of contacts and the kind of atmosphere that was beginning to evolve on the campuses?
Well, I think this theme came up in discussions during the day, which I followed with great interest, by the way. A terrific day of panels. It's this debate between whether you can have a managed control opening to the outside world or whether you're going to be paranoid. And of course, right now, I think she is in the paranoid stage, getting nervous about what was happening when he came into power. I think that happened then. Unlike Susan Shirk, for whom I had the highest respect, Deng Xiaoping is not a hero to me. He's a hero, and that's what she meant, on economics and opening in the US relationship. But on politics, of course, like every Chinese leader, and that's a constant theme throughout the last 50 years, and as long as they're in power, is the Leninist political attitude. And I think Deng and the other leaders, except for, of course, Zhao Ziyang, who he dumped. And by the way, Deng dumped Hu Yaobang, he dumped Zhao Ziyang. He was head of the anti-rightist campaign. Once he used Wei Jingxing and Democracy War to get himself in power, he locked him up. He's been pretty constant before Tiananmen Square. So even though Deng might have flirted for a while with opening, and he still tried to square the circle, I think he and the other leaders were getting nervous that this was beginning to get out of hand.
Winston, before we take some questions from the audience, let me just ask you that you were back in the government when Jiang Zemin was party general secretary, and rather miraculously, some elements of opening and reform did return after 1989. And I wonder how you looked at that period at the time. Did you think, well, we're back on track here for reform and a fundamentally somewhat convergent relationship with China?
Well, we were trying to repair the relationship. This was, of course, only 4 years after Tiananmen. And so the trick was to expand the relationship, to handle the human rights situation in a context that didn't take precedent over everything else, but remained important, and to build up not only our bilateral relationship, but begin to cooperate on some global issues. Of course, China was much less powerful in those days. By the way, Jiang Zemin and Clinton may have gotten on later, but their first meeting was a total disaster in Seattle because Clinton made the mistake of asking Jiang Zemin to talk about Chinese reforms, and he went on for an hour and a half. And it was a terrible relation. We all went out, I briefed the press and told everyone how they loved each other, and it was a fantastic meeting, but it really didn't get off. But they got on better later. To answer your question, Orville, we knew it was going to be a tough slog, but we were hopeful that we could lay a broader basis for the relationship. We did see some minute efforts after WTO and so on, which came after I was assistant secretary, that maybe they would open up, but our hopes were dashed in recent years.
So why don't we open it up to questions? So if you have a question, please come to the microphone and we will take them. While we're waiting, a few people are coming, maybe a quick answer to the question of what would you do now if you were in office to try to turn things around, get things back on track?
Well, the first thing was done in Bali. I hope it does stabilize the relationship. It did lower the temperature. We'll have to see, as many pointed out, what happens on Taiwan, not just McCarthy visit, but arms sales and other legislation in Congress. I have trouble finding fault with what the Biden administration is trying to do. And I'm no shield for them, and I'll criticize them. And their big gap, of course, is having no good economic initiative and proposals for the Indo-Pacific area. If you don't open the US market, others aren't going to be interested. So that's the single biggest gap, and it's a bipartisan gap. So I happen to believe that we should keep the lines of communication over. I want to make clear we've made some mistakes, even though I put myself in the two to tango camp. But as I said, leaders are decisive, and I think Xi has made a decisive difference. So I'm frankly, we should try communication, we should try negotiation, but the basic Biden policy of invest, align, and compete, I think makes sense. I think they made very clear they're not trying to be number one over everybody. I think it is clear, as Melody pointed out, that we would be happy to have China compete in a reasonable way, and that we're not trying to dominate the world. And I think we made clear that we will stand by certain pledges. So I feel that the key to our success and better relations with China is getting our own act together here at home. And that's why the first one of investing means soft power and hard power, saving our democracy, reinvesting in our future to be competitive, then aligning with other countries for greater leverage on China. And then on top of that, competing peacefully is not only the best course for America and our policy around the world, but I think it'll gain China's respect and attention. And with China, we have to divide it into three areas that many have pointed out. The first one is cooperate where we can, and Melanie's given some examples of that, pandemic, climate, et cetera, and we ought to keep doing that. We have to stress to China that they're helping with us on this is in the global interest and in their self-interest, and not a favor to us. So I wouldn't give up on those possibilities. Secondly, you compete where you can, economics and other areas, but again, trying to stand by international norms and rules, many of which China has violated. And then thirdly, the insoluble problems, you have to manage them. And here we need red lines and military to military contacts. I didn't see that coming out of Bali. I might have missed it, but I think it's important we head off accidents and miscalculation. So I think this general approach is the correct one, and I think it's the most apt to succeed. But as long as Xi is in power, I'm pessimistic.
Okay, first question, identify yourself, please. And let's make questions quick, and I love those question marks at the end of a brief sentence.
Jed Schwartz, county writer, sociological perspective. Do you think, Ambassador, that one of the underlying causes of the increased tensions between the United States and China and Russia, for that matter, also has to do with the increased levels of unequal wealth distributions in all three of those countries? That is, it's a kind of unconscious or semi-conscious attempt to deflect resentment against the very wealthy against an external enemy. Either so that either we would, I mean, it's not a coincidence, I'm suggesting, that, you know, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and even Joe Biden.
Let's find a question mark here.
The question is, do you agree with that description of the situation? Thank you very much.
Give a quick answer, I can say no. Now, I do think the domestic dimensions are crucial here with US and China. We ought to be treating the China challenge as a Sputnik moment. Wake up, we have tremendous assets. China's got tremendous problems, and we ought to be able to compete confidently, but that requires the answer to the first of the two big questions in our relationship, both of which are domestic. Can we save our democracy? We had a glimmer of hope last week. I'm not trying to be partisan here, but is that a blip, or are we on the way to getting to a point where we can invest both in our soft power as an example and to make our system work, and in our hard power so we can compete? So that's the key question for our China and our world policy, and that is our domestic strength and democracy. The other key question, which has always been there, is whether the China model, which I think has changed back under Xi, but whether the China model, which has been tremendously successful in many ways for the last 10 to 20 years, whether it can defy history and proceed to grow despite the lack of political openness and freedom. The jury is still out on that. So those are the two key questions to our relationship. So you're right, there is a domestic dimension, but I wouldn't put it the way you do.
Next question.
Okay, well, thank you. My name is Ming Ye. I teach at Boston University. So my question is about the Chinese political economic logic. So I think we have a lot of discussions from top down, but what about bottom up, right? So the Chinese people, of course, very diverse, but in general, I think they want to have a stable government and society to achieve their economic aspiration. And then ruling elites, the party members, ruling elites, and they are afraid about stability, and they think the Communist Party is the only available organization to stabilize China. And then moving a little bit up, and then the party elites then think Xi Jinping is the only person at this point of time of Chinese development that converges, can deliver the stability, the strong party, hence stability, hence development. So I think that kind of logic and rationale is pretty prevalent within China. I wonder whether whether you accept this logic, and whether U.S. As operate in the future can operate on this China logic and work on that foundation. Thank you.
Well, a lot of this was discussed during the day and very well, and I don't have time to do it justice. I wouldn't presume to speak of what the prevalent view is among the Chinese people. That society now is so opaque. I have no idea how people really feel. It is clear that they're human beings like everyone else, and they need a good life materially, but I also think they're human beings that desire some degree of autonomy and political freedom. And you can see that it is not Chinese necessarily to not care about democracy. Just look at Taiwan, which has got a Chinese flavor to it. The issue is whether stability can come, and again, this was discussed earlier, from this clampdown, from the shutting off of innovation and free flow of ideas, of people not telling the leaders or the leader what may be going wrong. And so I think there's some real questions whether Xi's policy of controlling from the outside rather than managing outside influence can succeed in economic terms. And that in turn has a lot to do with political stability. So I don't pretend to say whether the Chinese logic is prevalent the way you describe it. I just think Chinese are human beings like anyone else. And I think there's other elements here that man or woman does not live by rice alone.
Next question.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Kuei. My question is, what the history teaches us our lessons, what we learn from the lessons from the history, like 1989, the crash after that, and then US support the leadership later on. So what we can do differently back then, it will help us now, you know. So, what's your opinion?
When you say, what can we do, who's the we?
United States.
Well, I mean, again, history tells me several things about China in my experience, the last 50 years. I've always felt that the Chinese leaders from the very beginning, even though it was a long-term proposition, were determined to reassert China on the world stage. After all, China is the Middle Kingdom. It dominated the world for thousands of years, where other countries were either tributaries or barbarians or irrelevant. Then China had a very tough century, to say the least, in which they were humiliated by the West. And only lately has China gone from a poor country to a regional power to now a global power. So for the first time in its history, China is dealing with the outside world as equals. And this makes for a very complicated psychology and a difficult one to deal with, to answer your question. Namely, you have a mixture of self-confidence, even arrogance, based on thousands of years of Middle Kingdom dominance and a great culture and history, mixed with a sense of humiliation and vengeance because of outside powers' domination for a century. And you see that exhibited in Xi, where it's a combination of self-confidence and grand plans for China's future, mixed with paranoia and I think a sense of insecurity and a feeling that they're being challenged and threatened by the West. So it's very difficult to deal with this psychology. Saying what we should learn from history, I think the common threads in our China policy should continue. I would argue that one of our great successes in American foreign policy has been our policy toward China and Taiwan in the last 50 years. Very great challenge. We've had ups and downs, but China's managed to grow. We've managed to have, until recently, a fairly stable relationship with all our differences. Meanwhile, Taiwan has flourished economically and democratically, and its security has been assured. And that's been a bipartisan policy that's been pursued by 9 presidents. So let's give ourselves some credit for the past. But for the future, I think it's going to take the same elements in general from the American side. First of all, have a strategic perspective. That's true generally in foreign policy. It's going to sound like bromides, but they're true in China. Secondly, put yourself in the other person's shoes. We do have to, and many speakers mentioned that, put ourselves in China's perspective, including some of the things we've done which would look suspicious or antagonistic to them. Thirdly, always appeal to their self-interest as opposed to exhorting. They're not going to move on things unless you have a mixture of pressures and incentives, but above all, appeal to their self-interest. That's what Nixon and Kissinger did from the very beginning. And then, as I've said, we've got to build up our own strength and be self-confident in our competing peacefully. I agree with Susan Shirk and many others that the overreach by China, and specifically Xi, has been matched by overreaction in this country, sort of a hysteria, not just the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment, but a feeling that China is going to take over the world. And we said the same thing about the Soviets during the Cold War, Japan in the 1980s. I think we have every advantage over China in terms of assets if we get our act together at home. So self-confidence, treat this as a Sputnik moment, as I said, is our best way of dealing not only with our global position and our domestic cohesion, but with China.
Maybe one more question, please.
Good evening, Ambassador. My name is Harsh. I'm an officer of the Indian Civil Service and pursuing a degree at Harvard Kennedy. I'm curious to understand what the role you foresee for India in the US-China relationship going forward. In particular, the National Security Strategy document that came out recently laid a fair amount of emphasis on the Quad. Is that the sole platform that you think the US should be engaging with India with regard to the China relationship? Or do you think a closer involvement perhaps with the Sino-Indian border dispute, which I think is the main bone of contention between the two countries of Asia? How do you see it playing out, and what do you think US policy should be? Thank you.
Well, the key policy toward India, and I think the Biden administration and previous ones have tried to do this, is to treat relations with India as an end in itself and not as a weapon against China. Implicit is their concern about China, and part of the blowback and the overreach to what Xi's been doing is what they've done with India, not to mention what they've done in Southeast Asia, Taiwan, South China Sea, and interfering in other countries. But rather than making India forcefully choose sides, and that's been true of our approach to various countries around the world, we ought to explore common interests and let the inherent security dimension take care of itself. India, even though it's disillusioned with China, given geography, given the nuclear weapons dimension, given their competition, they're not going to want to alienate China, and we shouldn't make them overtly choose, but we can work constructively with them, and several administrations, including this one, have got off to a good start with that.
Well, maybe we'll leave it here. Winston, thank you so much. We miss you. We had a great 2 days here in Cambridge, and God willing, you will join us next time.
Well, I miss
Thank
being
you.
there. I caught most of the panels today. I also will miss the fact that I could be seeing Yale win the Ivy League football title tomorrow. I'm sorry to miss that.
You won't want to see the results,
No.
Winston. Winston went to Yale. Well, thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Are we meant to be wrapping up? Okay, it's been a long day. So, but a very fruitful day. So we're not going to detain you too much longer. It was down as some kind of concluding comments, but I guess I'd say just very quickly 4 things. One word that strikes me as encompassing what we've been talking about is quite simply complexity. I think at every discussion we've had, we've just got down deeper and deeper into more levels of complexity. And I see that manifested in a lot of the discussions. Second point, I would say, I think I see with Xi Jinping's approach a very odd combination of Marxism with his idea of historical materialism and a very traditional Chinese notion of tianxia. The idea that, traditionally China was at the core of a cultural sphere which radiates out, but now I think it's also at the core of an economic sphere that radiates out, which goes beyond regional to global. And there, I think, again, the complexity comes up that we've talked about of, are we seeing that distinction between what first was described as an economic Asia with China at the core and a security Asia which still has the United States at the core? Is that now moving to a global set of challenges in terms of economic and security divisions? But what I heard there, and particularly Ian from Singapore mentioned that, even though it's 4 o'clock in the morning, I thought that he posited that actually that's much more complex to simply divide this out, that there is an economic Asia or even an economic dimension which really has increasingly China at the core. And that's something we need to think about, because what does it actually mean for the relationship? And related to that, I think there's a question of that we touched on, China's domestic challenges and what that will mean for growth. And I think this is really important for understanding the relationship, because should the growth slow to only 1 or 2%, or even stay at 3%, it's going to mean that we're dealing with a very different China in terms of the way it can deal with its domestic challenges that we heard, the aging, various other things, but also meeting international obligations. Can it keep up the same levels of investment? Can it fund fully, as in the past, the military obligations it feels it has to resist the United States of America? And what in that sense does that mean for how people in Washington should be seeing the relationship? And so the next level of complexity that comes out for me here is that we need to think about multiple scenarios if we're going to think about the nature of the relationship moving forward, and not get locked into the idea that there's a singular path. And also, whatever our scenario is, we're going to have to keep revising it because the world is changing constantly. And the relationship as a result will have to keep changing consequently to be able to track with that. And the last point really takes me back to where I started off this morning. And that is, I do believe that if we want to achieve global public goods, there has to be ways to find discussion and collaboration in key areas. I think one question there is China actually willing to take on responsibility for providing more of the global public goods? Is it willing to pay for them? Is it willing to engage in that sense in the way that America has in the past? And again, I come back to the three areas that I think about for trying to push that together, the idea of a global commons. And we see movement there around climate change, but there's many others. Global engagement with areas such as pandemic, piracy, high seas, water, so on and so forth. And then last but not least, which we touched on in one of the panels, the dramatic need for global regulation in key areas around trade, investment, and cyber security, for example. So it's been a wonderful day, and I just want to go back to thanking everybody again who put this together. Orville first approaching us with these ideas, and then Mary Kay and others putting this together, and Dinda and Edward and Mark, of course, who's also been instrumental in shaping the agenda that's taken us through this somewhat long, but very entertaining and very valuable day, I would say. Mark, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you very much, Tony. Since I've been back here in academia, I oftentimes hear, Mark, I want to just hear what you think. What do you think should get done? Well, I will say that day will come, but I think I'm going to disappoint you today because I've learned through the years, you never really can top Tony Seixas' analysis. So I'm going to close with just three mundane points. The first is I'm going to reiterate what Tony just said as a word of thanks, but I'm going to do it a little bit more overtly, which is just to say an event like this, 10 hours with at many points during the day, over 1,000 people viewing this online. The fact that this has gone, except for the opening moments, largely without a glitch, is thanks to a terrific team that I have at the Fairbank Center and that Tony has at the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia. So I just want to invite everybody who's been part of making this happen, also from the Asia Society, from UCSD's 21st Century Center. If all of you can come up to the front of the room here and please take a bow. And I know my team at the back there. Please come on up. We're gonna do it. No, come up. There are countless hours of hard work going through lists, making sure the coffee is up to speed. And needless to say, I think Professor Seixas also wants to thank you for being an impromptu appointments committee as well. So thank you all very much for being here. So my second point is we talked today about the fact that we are locked in an intense strategic rivalry. And I think the contents of today's discussion make that clear. And yet we also talked about the fact that we must find ways by which to coexist. And so the thing I want to do is to draw much more back to what happened today. What happened today is a demonstration, at least for our Chinese friends, of how the United States and I believe Western liberal society would like to engage on this question of how do we find a means to coexist. And if we don't like the term coexist, if that's too loaded, as we heard in the first panel, we can use some other gong, whatever verb you wish to follow from that. We can use a different 词 than gong if that's not acceptable. But I think we know what we mean. We should not be locked into a disagreement over semantics. We all inhabit the same planet. But I think it's important for those viewing this, and I know there will be people who will be viewing this event after the fact, to understand that for us, it is important that we have debate, we have disagreement, we remain open to views, not just Chinese views, but views and input from all around the world, that we acknowledge mistakes, we correct mistakes, and we believe in subjecting our current and former officials to open questioning from the public. That is the terms of how many of us who live in these societies view as how we would like to engage in the debate of how we would like to exist in a world where we coexist. And so I want to remind everyone that it's important for us to realize we can discuss everything, but there are ways in which we wish to live as individuals who live on this planet, and that we must find ways to preserve how that can be done. And so my last point is to all of you. We've talked many times today about the United States, about China, about other countries, and we talk in these very abstract terms, and of course we are academics, right? We like to talk in terms of theory. We like to have different concepts that have different meanings. We like to talk about ideologies and so forth. But at the end of the day, as I reminded all of us when we began this day, the vast majority of citizens who live in these two countries and who live on this planet all want the same thing. And it is important, especially for those of you who are students, who are young, and especially those of you who are determined to seek that common future, to realize we all have agency in this. We are not here simply to say we accept what our leaders do. We are not here to say this is the world, the times we live in, so we must learn to live with it. We have agency in shaping a world in which we can coexist and to address the common problems. So I hope for all of you sitting here, you leave today a little bit more charged to take that agency and to find ways to, as I said earlier this morning, to navigate the choppy waters ahead so that we can find a way to achieve what we all seek together as human beings. Thank you very much for being with us here today. Thank you. Thank you.